Hello and greetings once again. As this time we look forward to the 13th Sunday of the year. And the scripture readings to start with, the first reading comes from the book of Wisdom, chapter 1, verses 13 through 15, and then chapter 2, verses 23 to 24. Two selected verses for our consideration. The second reading, again, continues the section from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, this time chapter 8, verses 7, 9, 13 through 15. So a little editing goes on in that section of Paul's letter. And finally, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. Now, what I thought we would do today is to look at, because this is the year, of course, of Mark, to look at chapter 5 of Mark's story, which is one of the most interesting and in some ways colorful of the narration that Mark presents. As we will notice, and as we've mentioned before, a lot of times Mark simply moves through events very quickly. But in chapter 5, he slows down, he gets very detailed in a certain way, and has an interesting message. Basically, what we're going to be looking at is the beginning of chapter 5, which are verses 1 through 20. Now, this episode will not be recorded or on this weekend, but then the rest of the chapter will be. So, but there's a connection between those verses and which we will not hear and the ones that we do. It involves three healings. The first is the healing of a man, and then the ones that we will listen to are the healings of two women. But there is a connection in this chapter with regard, and maybe the essential question is that of faith. All right, so where do we begin? We begin in chapter 5 by the fact that, you remember last week, the disciples and Jesus had been in a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee and now coming to the shore, which technically was known as the territory of the Decapolis, of the 10 cities, which would be characterized by the fact that they made up a Gentile population. Although that's not exactly correct, because there was some Jewish settlements rather, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee also. Now, the story begins as Jesus gets off the boat with his disciples, that a man rushes up to him who is what we would call a demoniac. He is, and a colorful description of the man is given as this unfolds. In other words, the disciples and Jesus step on the shore, and comes this whom we call the Gerasene man, and he comes rushing up. Now, what is this? This is a man who probably is called in this, well, not probably, but is called in the scripture a demoniac. He is possessed. And it's important perhaps to notice, as I mentioned before, possession often is a characterization of a person who does not act normally. He acts in a way that seems very strange, and so the knowledge says, oh, he's possessed of this. Well, this, and here is where Mark gives a very colorful description. In fact, this little opening section has 4 little parts to it. Now keep in mind, we're talking about the first 20 verses of chapter 5. First part is this encounter that Jesus has with the possessed man. This we will see is followed by an episode with a herd of pigs. The third section, reaction of the people from the nearby town. And then the fourth part of this section, the mission that is given to the formerly possessed man and what his task now is given by the Lord. So what are the characteristics of the possessed man? He is characterized by having extraordinary strength. He runs around, he shouts. They try to put shackles on him to keep him in place. He breaks them. He lives in the caves on the shore of the lake here. No one can kind of control him. So truly, he's an extraordinarily sick man. Now, he also is pictured as foaming at the mouth, as he doesn't hurt anyone as such, but almost sometimes seems to hurt himself and runs around just kind of acting crazy, and therefore people keep their distance from him. Now, medically, remember, the medicine of the first century world is nothing like ours. He interestingly characterizes a man who might be having an episodic fit, an epileptic fit, because all of the things that we now know about epilepsy, that when an attack happens on a person, sometimes called, remember, a grand mal, the very things that are narrated by Mark, the man exercises. He almost does harm to himself, and they have to hold him down, put something in his mouth to prevent him from hurting himself, and then when that episode is finished, he seems to return back where he was. So this is the kind of man that approaches Jesus. Now, in Mark's language here, the man speaks. "We know who you are, Jesus. Do not harm us." So it's interesting that the language that is given to the possessed man is a language which allows him, keep in mind always the audience, to identify that he can identify who Jesus is. Well, what happens is that as now the man comes and falls down in front of Jesus, and Jesus here now looks to be ready to heal him, the man says, "Do not harm us, for we are legion." And if you're going to do something, he says, they say, we, plural, "cast us into this herd of swine," who happen to be kind of in the area, a rather large swine herd. And of course, if you want a good story, you always kind of make sure it's memorable by numbers. And so Jesus agrees. He says, "All right, if you want to go into the swine you go." And the pigs run over along the cliff, jump off the cliff, and drown into the sea. Colorful episode, isn't it? Well, what's all this about? Well, of course, a little bit of humor here. Swine would be the kind of animal, you remember, pigs, that were understood as being unclean. So there's a ritual aspect to this. And this, if you're going to cast out a bad spirit, this is a good place to do it. So it's an interesting cure. The reaction to the people of the place when they hear what's going on, ask Jesus to please leave. So why would they ask after the man who brings healing to leave? Well, I suppose, and there's good stories always have a little bit of humor and practicality to it. The townspeople say, you know, you cast all those pigs into the sea, there goes the profit. What more will you do to hurt industry if you start doing this stuff? So maybe one of the practical reasons why they want Jesus to be gone is just to save the economy. And there are a number of interpretations of this story, and certainly I'm not sure that's a major one, but that's one that one might consider. When this happens, the man wants to be a follower of Jesus, and Jesus says, no, you can't join our group, but go back to your home, go back to where you live, and tell the story of what has happened to you. Now, notice the dialogue that is given by the Spirit, that we are legion. Now, the word legion, and usually in the text when you read it, we'll notice that the L is capitalized. A legion could simply in English mean many, but that doesn't seem to be the point here. Some see here as an interesting story that Mark remembers that is, to be honest with you, a bit political. Because who was governing this whole area, namely all of the territories around the Mediterranean, but Rome? And how did Rome govern? By sending in its forces, its troops. And legion represented a certain number, often a legion, and here there's a variation on the theme, but often it included 100 soldiers. As I mentioned before, soldiers not so much wanting to fight a battle, but rather to keep law and order. And so Rome had taken over. And if this is true, if legion says, interestingly, to Jesus, don't destroy us, but cast us into the swine, a kind of smile could go up. If that's what Rome, and here now maybe legion represents the Roman presence, and this would make it a kind of protest story. If that's what you want, says Mark's Jesus, then so be it. And when they go into the swine, what do? They run off the cliff and are drowned. Now, isn't that what many would hope to happen to Rome? Now remember, a little bit of background here, that the Gospel of Mark, written around somewhere close to the year 70, maybe a year or two before, most likely a year or two afterwards, had happened after in Israel there had been an uprising. One remembers in the year 65 up to the year 70 had been what was known as the First Jewish-Roman War. And Rome, in the course of that 5 years, had destroyed, ultimately in the year 70, the city of Jerusalem. But prior to that, in the Galilee, so that would be in the years 67, 68, the Roman troops had quickly overcome any resistance on the part of the Hebrew community and conquered the Galilee, which was the northern part of the Holy Land. So if Mark is now remembering that event as he writes this story, wouldn't it be nice that the conquerors, Rome, the soldiers, the legion, got ultimately what we hoped they deserved, to be cast into the sea. Now, does this mean anything, sea? Well, the Romans, remember, had taken the Mediterranean and called it Mare Nostra, our sea. So if that's what they would like, and here the geography of Mark is not exactly correct, but if they want to go into the sea and be drowned, let them be drowned in their own sea. That might be the end of Roman rule. So is this a protest story? Now, the place is called the Jezreel. The city of Gerasa, Jerosa, in modern terms is known as Jerash, Jerash, in which significant archaeological discoveries have been made that shows that it was a pretty important city in the Decapolis area of the time. Would have been about 37 miles away from where Jesus entered the land and where the story takes place. So all of that is a kind of background to say that some see this story as an interesting protest story. And there are a number of commentaries who see it in that way. Certainly in another way, it reveals Jesus as a healer. As we've mentioned before, very often Jesus is pictured, yes, teaching, but we never really know what he's saying, but rather by what he's doing. So you might read that story. It's really very colorful, very well described. As I mentioned, Mark is not given at times to details, but here he is. Now we're going to look at the second part of this chapter, chapter 5, which are verses, again, 21 through 43. This will be the longest section from Mark's Gospel that's used on Sunday reading, so get ready. Well, there's a shortened version, but it kind of missed the whole direction of this story. This is going to be an example of a technique that Mark is particularly good at doing, called a sandwiching technique. Namely, he will start an episode or a story, put another different story in the middle, and then conclude the story that he began. So that's what we mean by sandwiching, or what I can say parenthesing. In other words, the beginning and the end parenthesize a central story. So, excuse me, how does this begin? Well, it begins with Jesus now back on the other side, so he's crossed over from the episode we just mentioned. He is greeted as he comes ashore by a number of people. Jesus' popularity is beginning to spread. But at this moment, as he steps on shore, a synagogue leader named Jairus, he's a synagogue official. Now, it doesn't say he's a rabbi, but somehow he's the official, comes to Jesus. His name is Jairus, and he falls down in front of him and says to Jesus, "My little girl is sick. Would you please come and heal her or help her?" So that's the dynamic. Now, there's a large crowd that is there. This large crowd apparently will follow Jesus now as he says that he will come to the home of the synagogue leader. It is very unusual for a representative of a religious establishment to approach Jesus in this way. I suppose we could say he is a desperate parent and will do anything to help his daughter. And those of you who are parents probably can immediately begin to sympathize with Jairus and with his petition. As they are going along, a woman, and she is unnamed, and there are a couple of unnamed women in Mark's story, thinks to herself, this is interesting how the dialogue works. She has been afflicted, so we get a little background of this woman as she is going to think this. She has been affected by a hemorrhage, bloody hemorrhage, for 12 years. And she has spent considerable money looking for help. And she has gone to the medical people, and as a result of her consultation with them, her health only is worse than it was before. I'm not sure that any doctor's office will have this sign or this little passage from Mark's Gospel, because, as I said, her condition was worsened by visiting with the physician rather than helped. All right, just an aside. That's my own commentary on that. Excuse me. Now her thinking. She thinks to herself, if I but touch his cloak, I will be healed. So here is a marvelous woman of faith. Now, keep in mind that there's a large crowd here. which may explain why they don't notice her condition, because her condition with this hemorrhaging really rendered her ritually impure. Now, we've mentioned before the importance of ritual, and but perhaps given the size of the crowd and her lack of being recognized by others, allows her to kind of mix in. So, so she touches the cloak of Jesus, and he wheels around and he says to those with him, "Who touched me?" Well, Peter, ever the practical man, says, Jesus, you notice all these people pushing and shoving around here, and you ask, who touched me? Now, Peter, of course, takes the question quite literally and understandably, does not know what has happened. But Jesus has sensed that a power has gone out of him. Now, this is interesting because most of the times when healing cures take place, it is something that Jesus apparently is in charge of. Here, he's not in charge. It happens. God works through him. And kind of the woman now, a bit embarrassed by this whole event, comes up and owns up that she has touched him. Now, her touching him, from one point of view, some interpreters will say, could have rendered Jesus impure, because if someone impure touches someone pure, doesn't it kind of rub off? Interestingly here, the power of healing has rubbed off of Jesus into the woman's condition, and she is healed. Jesus says to her, your faith, your faith has saved you. Now, if you're following this story, remember where Jesus is supposed to be going. He's supposed to be going to the home of Jairus. If you're a parent and the daughter is sick, and this is an interruption, you could almost get, why is Jesus taking time with this woman? We need him to move on. We need him to do what he needs to do to help this sick girl. So you can kind of see the literary dynamic that Mark builds into this story. We kind of, all right, Jesus, you healed her, let's get on with it. But as they begin to move, messengers come from Jairus' house and say, don't bother the master anymore, your daughter has died. So there's a kind of dramaticness here as this message. You can imagine Jairus' response. Why did Jesus not just come quickly? But Jesus then says to Jairus, don't worry, she is only asleep. Now that's an interesting response. Jesus says, the child is not dead, she is asleep. Now what does sleep mean? Well, could call it the sleep of death too. So there's a little bit of an ambiguity about the response that Jesus makes to Jairus. Now then Jesus says, let's go on. And when he comes to the house of Jairus, he is greeted by the mourners, by weeping and wailing. Now in the custom of the time, although it's interesting that they would be there so quickly, but it was kind of a vocation of some people, mostly women, who, when one suffered the loss of a loved one, would come to the household and weep and cry, because in that gesture, thought that might bring some help and healing to the person who had lost a loved one. So the fact that there's this group there when Jesus arrives, in a way, again, reveals another custom of the Jewish, well, not just the Jewish community, but communities in general. But Jesus then says to them, the child is not dead. Now, you might sympathize with them. They kind of laugh at him. Really? And he puts them out, and he takes in to the room where the girl is Peter, James, and John, this famous little trio of, and the parents of the girl. Again, we don't know the mom's name. We don't know the girl's name. There's a lot that's unsaid here. Jesus goes up to the girl, touches her, says, "Arise," lifts her up, and she is alive. Now, here's the healing gift of Jesus. Some things to notice here. The girl is 12 years old. Now, some will make a connection between the fact that the woman with the hemorrhaging had suffered for 12 years and that the girl is 12 years of age. Now, what might be one point that Mark is making here? That both of them, after all, raising the young girl is a miracle, obviously, brings a new beginning to both. The woman who is cured of her situation is now able to return to full life within the community, a new beginning after some 12 years of really not being able to do that. The young girl is 12 years old. Now, 12, of course, is usually the time in life in which a person moves from being a child to an adult, but this also means that she moves, moves to be of marriageable age. So that would be a beginning for her. So that's another kind of why some look at the little details of this story. The fact of the 12 years of age, beginnings. Now, one of the other interesting things, and one that I always like that shows kind of humanness on the part of Jesus, is as he brings her up, sits her up, he says to those who are around her, "Give her something to eat." Now, those of you who have teenagers or young children know that they are always hungry. So I often think that Jesus here is a very practical kind of conclusion to this story by saying, make sure she has a lunch or whatever it is that they would have. So, in both cases, in the healing of the woman, she has touched Jesus with her hand, theoretically causing Jesus to be ritually impure. Jesus touches the girl, who theoretically, being deceased, would also put him in purity. So there's a little bit of suggestion of the importance of touching. Jesus, the touch of healing. So the woman touching Jesus' cloak is healed. The girl being touched by Jesus is healed. So all of these stories now, kind of remembering that first story that we began with, the man who was possessed, are healed. And all of them are healed because of the quality and gift of faith. But as I mentioned, the woman is healed, and sometimes I like that story, just as we conclude, to say that we always picture Jesus in charge. Everything happens because he's in charge. Well, she is healed through the power of God. And so perhaps the point of these three stories, healings, is that the power of God is at work through Jesus. And that's what Mark's point, I think, in remembering these stories. So chapter 5, very important and beautiful, with nicely written works. You will hear from the pulpit on Sunday the story of the two women. You will not hear the story of the possessed man. But perhaps if you have the opportunity to read them together, to see how God, in a wonderful and marvelous way, is working through Jesus to bring the power of healing into the world. And this, I would suggest, is the purpose and point of this chapter 5 section of Mark's story. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.